This talk today was inspired by two exhibitions, Aubrey Beardsley, Decadence and Desire at the Victoria and Albert Museum and Aubrey Beardsley at Tate Britain. As always, as I said, the talk was inspired by these, but it's not really based on them. So it's not meant to be a tour around the exhibition. It's just an inspiration, an idea. Now, today it's Aubrey Beardsley. And before I begin, I should issue a warning, as I will be showing and describing sexually explicit images. So if you're likely to be offended by these, please switch off now. If not, I'll get started. Oh, on one other point, I was reading yesterday that Aubrey Beardsley should properly be pronounced Aubrey Beardsley, but I won't be doing that. So if you're offended by that, please switch off now. Right. The main thing to remember, I think, about Aubrey Vincent Beardsley is that he died when he was just 25. And so all of his career took place over about 6 years in the 1890s, which is also significant. It was known as the age of decadence. And this quote that I've put up here by Beardsley sums up the mood of the period. I have one aim, the grotesque. If I am not grotesque, I am nothing. It was a period when this world-weary mood swept across Europe, or at least swept across the intelligentsia of Europe, combined with a sort of boredom, cynicism, and included intense forms of sexual perversity. It was, in some ways, an irrational and subjective revolt against the materialism and rationalism of the bourgeois society as they saw it. But let's focus on, I'll come back to that, but let's focus on Beardsley for now. He was born in Brighton, in this house, which is still there. It's now 31, it was then number 12, Buckingham Road, sorry. And you can probably see on the side of the house there's a plaque, and on it, it describes that it was the house where Beardsley was born, and describes him as the master of line, an accurate description. His father had a private income from an inheritance. His maternal grandfather was a property developer, so it was from those properties that he got an income. But when he married Ellen Pitt, who was a well-known, well-established and respected family in Brighton, he was sued for breach of promise because he'd already promised to marry another woman. And in the end, he had to sell his properties, and that lost most of the family fortune. They moved to London, and his father moved from job to job, battling poverty for the next 20 years. His father died after Aubrey Beardsley when he was 40 of tuberculosis. And so it was Beardsley himself, his salary, later his fees and so on, helped to maintain the whole family in a sort of genteel middle-class poverty. Now, Beardsley, I mentioned tuberculosis of his father. Beardsley was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which was then called consumption, when he was 7. When he was 17, he suffered a serious hemorrhage, and again, he suffered a serious bout when he was 24, the year before he died. So he knew he wouldn't live long from an early age. And from the age of 17, he knew he could die at any time. And so he worked all hours extremely hard to produce as much as possible, because he knew that every day could literally be his last. This is his sister Mabel. Now, some claim that Beardsley was homosexual, but as far as we know, he had no romantic associations of either sex. Although there are some stories of failed or imagined, perhaps, attempts at seducing women. There's also a rumor that he had an incestuous relationship with his sister, Mabel. However, the only evidence I've found is that 27 years later, 27 years after his death, in fact, a scandal-mongering journalist Frank Harris, claimed that Beardsley had confessed to him about having an incestuous relationship with his sister, and she'd conceived and aborted their child. And some critics have seen the fetus-like creatures in some of his drawings as evidence of alleged miscarriage. I don't see it that way. I don't think it's very likely. The evidence is not compelling. They were close, though. Mabel became an actress who achieved what the critics said mild notoriety for her exotic and flamboyant appearance. She's addressed here in an Elizabethan costume with a stuffed falcon, although I think that's probably the idea of the artist, Oswald Burley. This is them as children. Mabel was a year older than him. They were both brilliant children. Just to give you an example, Mabel was reading Dickens when she was 5. And one day, when Mabel was reading, her mother heard her sigh. Asked what the matter was, she said, "I really do draw the line at Carlyle," and she was 6 years old. Later, I think as a party piece, she could recite from Dickens word for word for 2 hours on end. This is Beardsley. When he was 12, he played in public concerts. Music was his passion. He was an infant musical phenomenon. That's a quote from a critic at the time. He also acted. And the year after, when he was 13, he attended Brighton Grammar School for the next 4 years. And at the school, he wrote poems, drawings, cartoons. He appeared in the school magazine. He used to do caricatures of the school teachers there, which the school teachers, it seems, appreciated, because he was seen to be, he was a model for other students because he was so hardworking. And I've explained the reason for that already. When he was 16, he finished at school and worked in an architect's office in London. His family had already moved to London. He lived with an aunt in Brighton. And then he worked for an insurance company. Mabel, painted by the same artist, played with Beardsley in those music concerts when they were young. And later she became a well-known actress and toured America. Later, after Beardsley had died, she married a fellow actor. She was friends with the poet W.B. Yeats, who, if you know the poem, he attended her deathbed and later wrote the poem Upon a Dying Lady. She also incidentally died of tuberculosis, so it was in the family. Right, Beardsley had no formal art education, but he loved drawing from an early age. And his early drawings, that is late teenage drawings, were influenced by the work of Edward Burne-Jones. And I'll give you an example here. This is a Burne-Jones of St. George killing the dragon, and you can see the similarities. Beardsley was also influenced by Rossetti and particularly by Whistler. So in the summer of 1891, he was then 19, Beardsley and his sister Mabel went to see Whistler's paintings and his famous Peacock Room at the home of the wealthy shipowner Frederick Leyland. It was common to be able to visit homes that included art on appointment. And shortly after, in fact, on Sunday, the 12th of July, they visited Burne-Jones' studio, believing that they allowed visitors on production of a visiting card, another technique. You turn up, show your visiting card, and somebody would show you around. In fact, his home hadn't been open to visitors. He'd become too famous, too many people wanted to come. It hadn't been open for years and they were turned away. But Burne-Jones must have overheard them being turned away, because Burne-Jones himself hurried down the street, and just as they were turning the corner, we know this because from Beardsley's letters, and he stopped them, brought them back to his house, and luckily Beardsley had his portfolio with him and Burne-Jones looked at it. Burne-Jones was incidentally a very harsh critic. But in this case, he said, there's no doubt about your gift. One day you would most assuredly paint very great and beautiful pictures. All are full of thought, poetry, and imagination. Nature has given you every gift to become a great artist. I seldom or never advise anyone to take up art as a profession, but in your case, I can do nothing else. So Burne-Jones showed him around his studio, made introductions, and recommended a formal study of art at art school. They then had tea on the lawn. As it happened, the Oscar Wildes were visiting the Burne-Jones. So Beardsley and his sister met the Wildes, and this was a momentous endorsement that launched his career. It obviously, this one meeting didn't make him famous, but it gave him the right connections. So he did enroll at the evening sessions. He was still working. So the evening sessions at Westminster School of Art under Professor Fred Brown. And Brown taught him the basics of outline, composition, individual expression. And he also, Beardsley, discovered the work of the illustrator Walter Crane at this time, another influence on his work. And in terms of personality, at this stage, early on, when he visited Burne-Jones, he was described as shy, nervous, and self-conscious. But we know from other people who met him that within 18 months, he'd become self-assured and at ease in intellectual company. He also became an eccentric and a dandy. He invented himself. Wilde described him later as having a face like a silver hatchet and grass green hair. I don't know why he said that. Beardsley denied having green hair, but he was a meticulous dresser. Like Beau Brummel 100 years before, he would wear dove grey suits and yellow gloves. So he took the opportunity in 1892 of traveling to Paris, and there he saw the posters of Henri Toulouse-Lautrec and was influenced by the Parisian fashion for Japanese prints. On his return, he was asked to produce an illustration for the first issue of this magazine, The Studio. It's volume 1, number 1, and notice, and I'll outline it in red here, it says, a new illustrator, Aubrey Beardsley, written by Joseph Pennell. Now, Pennell was a well-known artist, a respected artist and writer at the time. So he was launched in a minor way, and in the magazine, which became popular, the illustration that was included with the article by Joseph Pennell is this one. It's of Siegfried. Maybe I'll just take the time to explain. It relates to Act 2 of Richard Wagner's opera Siegfried, part of the 4-opera ring cycle. And in the previous opera, Die Valkyrie, Siegfried was born as a result of the incestuous relationship between the twins Sigmund and Sieglinde. And in this opera, the next one, Siegfried, the baby has grown up into an adult. And here we see him killing the dragon Fafner. You can see the dragon behind him and his head by Siegfried's foot. And Fafner was guarding in his cave the ring of the Nibelungen, which grants the owner the power to rule the world, and the Tarnhelm, which is like a mask of invisibility, and Siegfried takes them. Notice that Beardsley's style at this time has got what's often called this hairline calligraphic flourishes in it, these very fine lines that he adds for decorative effect, and he simplifies those away later, but this is typical of his early style. In fact, he gave this drawing to Burne-Jones. He presented it to him, and Beardsley was flattered that Burne-Jones put it up in his drawing room alongside drawings and prints by Albrecht Dürer and others. Now these little works, they're actually, the originals are quite small. Beardsley described as fanciful grotesques, little more than doodles. They were drawn to illustrate a collection of 18th century wit described as bon mot. And Beardsley wrote in a letter to a friend, "I have been 10 days over them and just got a check for £15 for the work, my first art earnings." So he was just starting out. The fetus-like creature, by the way, in the right, is one of the pieces of so-called evidence that historians have used to speculate about the incestuous affair with his sister Mabel that I mentioned. But as I said, there is no real evidence. By the way, notice the signature, which is the 3-bar symbol with the three chevrons. It's sometimes 3 hearts underneath. This was a signature device, a symbol that Beardsley created to identify his work, like other artists at the time. James McNeill Whistler, for instance, used a butterfly. Albert Moore used a shell. We don't know what it means. I'm not sure it means anything, although some historians have said that it symbolizes sexual intercourse. Well, I'm not sure I see that, but that's what is sometimes said. Now, just on technique, in an interview given with the press, Beardsley claimed he was a prodigy, which he was, that he could draw effortlessly as long as he drew in what he called mystic seclusion. In fact, we know now that he sketched everything first in pencil, constantly rubbing out and blocking in until the whole surface was raddled, covered in lines, pencil lines. He then drew over this with Chinese ink, often ignoring the pencil lines because he had a new idea of the form he wanted. And finally, he would remove all the pencil lines, rub them out, just leaving the ink, looking like he'd drawn it first time, which is what he claimed to the press. There are a few artists who can do that. David Hockney is one who could draw just a single perfect line first time. But he was nevertheless a prodigy. Now, he was commissioned by the publisher Joseph Dent to illustrate a new edition of Le Morte dArteur, which is a late medieval story of the legendary fictional King Arthur by Thomas Malory. And Dent wanted to produce a lower cost version than all the books being published by William Morris in the using the Kelmscott press, which were very expensive. Dent was lucky enough to run into the then 19-year-old Beardsley, and he paid Beardsley £200, a large amount for a young artist, but a lot less than what he would have had to pay an established artist. And Beardsley and Dent believed that it was going to be 20 full-page drawings to illustrate the Morte dArteur. But in the end, Beardsley produced 360 full and double-page drawings, as well as something like 1,000 ornaments and details. He was nevertheless still paid the same amount. On the right, we see a languid King Arthur, whose features are said to be based on Beardsley. Now, the King Arthur seems to be eyeing up an idiosyncratic god, Pan, in the background, and ignoring the looming beast, or what's described as the questing beast. Now, in style, if you look at the one on the drawing on the left, it's similar to the style used by William Morris and published at the Kelmscott Press, which is now the one on the right. This is William Morris, The Order of Chivalry. The difference is that Morris was steeped in medieval legend and medieval techniques, and he saw them as an antidote to the mechanization of the modern world. Beardsley, on the other hand, saw it as a job he'd been given, and he told Morris, "I'll be glad when it's done. I hate it so." Having said that, many of Beardsley's illustrations are completely original. In fact, even these two, you'll notice that the William Morris looks more like a medieval woodcut, which is what's intended, whereas there are a lot of features. There's look at the swirling forms of foliage around the image here. It's a lot more Art Nouveau than the William Morris. And then, of course, if you compare the William Morris with one of the other illustrations in Le Morte dArteur, the one I showed you just now, then they're completely different. Beardsley's is completely original. Morris, as I said, is invoking intentionally a medieval woodcut, and Beardsley is creating a new style of illustration. Now, although he did a lot more work for the £200 than was originally envisaged, it was enough for him to quit his office job. So at this time, he gave up working at I think it was then the insurance office, and spent all his time working on what he called black and white work, illustrations. Another example. So by this stage, the Morte dArteur was a very well-known and respected work. So having illustrated that, he became widely known, but he didn't have other commissions. And he said, again in a letter, that he besieged and browbeat publishers for other commissions. So he contacted them to get work, and other commissions followed because he'd done such a lot of work in the Morte dArteur. And one was for this Greek drama, Vira Historia, which means a true story, by Lucian of Samosata, which is a 2nd century AD work. And it's an interesting work. It's the earliest known work to describe outer space, space travel, alien life forms, and interplanetary warfare. It, at the beginning of the book, it says this whole book is a lie. And then it starts with some travelers being blown past the Pillars of Hercules. They arrive at an island with a river of wine, and then there's an enormous whirlwind that lifts them up to the moon. And then they become involved in a war between the life forms on the moon and those on the sun. And on one part of the moon, there are no women, and so babies are born from men's swollen calves, which is what you can see in the drawing on the right. You probably were wondering what's going on there. It's all part of the story which Beardsley is illustrating. I won't go through the whole. The sun wins, a peace treaty is agreed. They return to the earth. They're swallowed. Sorry, they're swallowed by a 200-mile-long whale, and they meet the people who live in the belly of the whale. They fight a war with them and win. Then they kill the whale by lighting a bonfire and escaping through its mouth. Then they find a sea of milk and an island of cheese, and they meet the heroes of Greek legend. And the book suddenly ends saying that further adventures will be described in a sequel. Another commission he received at this time, he's chasing publishers for commissions. Another one is to illustrate Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which is, and I'll show you 3 illustrations that he did for that. This is the first, The Mask of the Red Death. At one level, it's the story of a plague. It's a bit like COVID. Prince Prospero and 1,000 other nobles hide in an abbey to escape the plague, known as the Red Death. And towards the 5th or 6th month of seclusion, They hold a masquerade ball, which you see here, and a mysterious figure enters and makes his way through all the rooms of the ball. Prospero confronts the stranger and dies of the Red Death. They then examine the stranger and find there is no one there. The costume contains nothing, and the guests then begin to die one by one. The story actually makes a lot of use of color. Red signifies both life and death in the story, but Beardsley, of course, tells the story in black and white, mostly large areas of white and small areas of black, and just single lines mostly. Little texturing of the areas to indicate shadow, to indicate 3 dimensions. It looks flat, but it comes to life because of the purity of the line. Notice the curtains. If you look at the line, the single line on the left representing the curtain, notice Beardsley doesn't even bother to continue it down the bottom. The ceilings, the walls, the curtains are just white, but somehow it comes to life in our imagination. Incidentally, the central figure is Prince Prospero. Beardsley has transformed him into, I don't know, a princess, possibly a hermaphrodite, and he or she is only partly clothed, wearing a black corset which pushes up her breasts. Incidentally, the transformation into a princess is gratuitous, and obviously the breasts they're not in the story, but as we know, Beardsley often found ways of populating his work with bare breasts and erect penises, as we shall see. Another story in the series, Tales of Mystery and Imagination, is The Black Cat. In this story by Poe, the narrator mistakenly walls up a cat with the corpse of his dead wife, who he has just murdered. The police arrive and, cutting a long story short, they hear the screams of the cat, break the wall down, and find the furious cat sitting on the dead woman's upright head. Incidentally, the cat has only one eye. Well, I'll leave it like that. Beardsley's drawing is wonderfully economical. The one-eyed cat and the wall are both black, distinguished by a single white line outline and a patch of white fur on its chest. And then the final story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, from the Tales of Mystery and Imagination. In this story, we find out later in the story that a sailor owns a gigantic orangutan which escapes, climbs the outside of a house and kills Madame L'Espanne, and then strangles her daughter. And then the orangutan attempts to hide the body by stuffing it up a chimney. And going back to the beginning of the story, it involves an amateur detective who finds a locked room, the inevitable locked room, non-human hair, gold coins left in the room, so it wasn't a robbery, and an unknown language which is overheard by those outside the room. And he deduces the crime was committed by an orangutan, and the story really is a metaphor for the battle between brains and brawn, with brain power winning. Incidentally, Beardsley, of course, has drawn a creature that bears little resemblance to orangutan. It's got a tail like a monkey to begin with. It's also got pointed nails. It's wearing an earring, and it's carrying the young girl, the daughter, whose hair falls over her face. She's wearing a corset, pantalettes, and a single slipper. Notice down the bottom Beardsley's signature, and he's created a vivid scene with the sparsest of means, and is using, as Poe did, the death of a beautiful young girl to create dramatic effect. So we've now reached the second stage of Beardsley's career. In the first stage, he was establishing himself as a leading figure in the art world, particularly with the serious and traditional work that he did with illustrating Thomas Mallory's Morte dArteur. That established his reputation as a serious artist. Now, in the second stage, he achieved fame and became an art editor of this, the prestigious The Yellow Book. And we'll come on to it later, but in the third stage, he achieved notoriety and his social reputation crashed because of his association with Oscar Wilde and the trial of Oscar Wilde. And he had to find, in fact, he could only find work then illustrating more controversial works, which we'll come on to. So there's those three in his short 6-year career, there's those three stages. So in the second stage, The Yellow Book was a new former book that used the latest line block printing techniques, where a photograph will be taken of a line drawing and the negative used to print onto a metal plate that had been photosynthesized by having a photo sensitive material painted onto the metal plate. So the negative was put on that and light shone through, which hardened the emulsion into acid resist, and the non-exposed areas were then washed away. The plate was then placed in an acid bath, which ate away where the metal had been exposed. And so where the negative was dark, the original was light. And so each black line in the original becomes a raised line in the plate and therefore a black line in the print. So using this technology for the first time, he could produce high quality line drawings in the Yellow Book. Incidentally, he was art editor and he excluded both Whistler and Oscar Wilde because he thought they would monopolize the publicity around the book. The book ran for just 3 years and Wilde declared himself glad when the venture was eventually a great failure, but for a while it was a great success. I'll explain why it was a failure. The book took its name from the way it used the same yellow covers as, what should we describe them as, scandalous, decadent French novels of the period typically had yellow covers. For example, in Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray is said to have been corrupted by reading so-called yellow books, these French novels, not this magazine. Now, when Wilde was arrested in 1895, there were rumors that he'd been carrying a yellow-bound book, and we now know that it was actually Pierre Louis' French novel Aphrodite, but the crowd confused it with a copy of this magazine. So it was thought that Oscar Wilde, who was reviled as a result of the trial, was carrying this magazine, and the crowd went to the offices of the publisher and threw stones through the window. And we'll hear later how Beardsley's career crashed at that point because the crowd had, and the public, in other words, had falsely associated him as the art editor with the book that Oscar Wilde was carrying. But let me step back and spend a little while talking about the period, and I'll first read these Punch cartoons and then explain what's going on. The one on the left, it says, Miss Sampson says, "Pray let me carry your bag, Mr. Smithereen." And Punch headline is, "What it will soon come to." And then on the right, Mrs. Blythe, newly married, says, "I wonder you never married, Miss Quilpson." And Miss Quilpson replies, "What, I marry? I be a man's plaything? No, thank you. So this is one of the changes that were going on in the 1890s. And in fact, in 1894 was the year that the term new woman was first used in the title of an article. And that article focused on the double standards in Victorian society, which insisted that a woman had to remain of implacable sexual virtue, while the husband could take a mistress and still be socially acceptable. The 1890s, known as, fin de siècle, or end of the century, or the naughty 90s they were called, was a time of enormous change in art, politics and science, and society was being revolutionized by these new ideas. Sexuality was being redefined. Darwin's theory of evolution was disrupting established religious beliefs, and his ideas led others to develop ideas of social Darwinism, as it was called, which defined decadence, decline and decay. Sigmund Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams at the end of this decade. H.G. Wells published The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man, and War of the Worlds, all in this decade. Moving pictures were first shown, X-rays were discovered, electric lighting became more widely used, first cars came into use, and the telephone became a practical device. And all these radical changes caused fear and outrage. And the social critic Max Nordau published a book called Degeneration, in which he forecast the end of civilization, resulting, he said, he had deduced from mental illness, which he traced back to the art, believe it or not, the art of the pre-Raphaelites. The reason he gave was because of the overall detail of the picture. The pictures had no point of focus, and therefore they illustrated a sort of an incipient mental illness that developed in society. Anyway, coming back to these Punch cartoons, as I said, one of the changes taking place was the new woman, a new breed of independent, educated women who were uninterested in marriage and children. And these new women were undermining the traditional view of women and what it meant to be feminine, and the role of men and what was understood by masculinity was also being undermined. Think of the aesthete, the dandy, think of Oscar Wilde or Beardsley. And as we've seen, Punch magazine, as many people did, made fun of the new women as an embittered, overeducated spinster. Yet there were men who found the idea of the new woman sensible and desirable, and many women were appalled by the idea of female emancipation. So in other words, it was a time of social change and a lot happening. This keynotes, part of that was set up the background to this, was written, as you see, by George Egerton, but that was just the pen name for Mary Dunn. She was born in Australia, traveled around the world, but then settled in London, and she wrote about working class women, and her novels were very popular. Keynotes was significant for its focus on female sexuality, and the illustrations are obviously by Beardsley. There were many articles and publications by women writers in the 1890s, and many appeared for the first time in the Yellow Book, and from 1896 onwards in a new magazine called the Savoy. And they all dealt, these articles dealt with controversial subjects such as marital discontent and the artistic and literary aspirations of women. It was at this stage in 1894 that Beardsley briefly turned to oil painting. Remember, Burne-Jones, when he first met Beardsley, has said that these drawings could be the basis of paintings. And Beardsley might have continued, but the volatile oils and varnishes were so bad for his tubercular lungs, he couldn't continue. There are actually two paintings on the same canvas here. I'll show you the other side of the canvas in a moment. This is one side. They're incidentally the only known oil paintings by him, and they're in the Tate, and both are unfinished. On this side, a Caprice. It's a sinister work that shows a woman in a black dress and a dwarf in a red costume. It's a bit clearer in the drawing. The painting was derived from this drawing by Beardsley, Comedy Ballet of Marionettes 1. It's one of a series of 3 that appeared again in the Yellow Book in July of 1894. Just to point it out, in both drawing and painting, the woman is being invited by the sinister dwarf to pass through a doorway, and the doorway, if you've noticed, has a phallic form, which is more explicit in the drawing, although in the second drawing of the series, the doorway actually has the form of a female sexual organ. Now, on the reverse of the painting on the left is the painting on the right, Masked Woman with White Mouse, and critics believe the symbolism is also sexual, as in Freud's theory of dreams, such things as mice become symbols or are symbols, he believed, in dreams of the genitals. Although I should point out that as far as we know, Freud's work was unknown in England at this time. And as I said, Interpretation of Dreams wasn't published until 1899. And in fact, the English translation wasn't until 1914. So moving on, that was the only painting we shall see, the only painting he did. We come perhaps to his most famous assignment, his illustrations for Oscar Wilde's Salami. It's seen by his historians as the first works in a British Art Nouveau style. Salami was published first in French in 1893, and almost immediately Beardsley made this illustrative drawing you can see speculatively. It wasn't commissioned, and it appeared in the Studio magazine that I mentioned earlier. Now, on the strength of this design, incidentally, I won't translate the French, and for those who speak French, I apologize. On the right, the illustration that he produced to go with the publication of the play that was published by John Lane, who commissioned Beardsley to illustrate the play. And we can see how this is an interesting comparison, because we can see how he redrew the original speculative illustration to produce what he called the climax on the right. He simplified the forms, and he's omitted these elaborate hairline calligraphic flourishes that he had in the earlier drawing and in earlier drawings, as we've seen. And it was this play, this illustrated play in English, that immediately rocketed Beardsley to public fame, to widespread fame, known, if you like, by every middle-class household when he was just 21. This is another illustration called The Stomach Dance from Salami. And this is the dance that Salami performed for King Herod Antipas in order to seduce him into granting her anything she wanted. It's now better known perhaps as the Dance of the Seven Veils, although that phrase was first used only in a stage direction in the play. As a reward for the dance, she did seduce the king, and as a reward, he promised her she could have whatever she wanted, and she asked for the head of John the Baptist, which we saw illustrated on the previous slide. Salami, incidentally, is from the Bible. It's in Mark and Matthew, although she isn't, the daughter, Salami, isn't mentioned by name in the Bible. She's first mentioned in a Jewish text produced in about AD 80. And in fact, the story is told in one of in the 19th century by Gustave Flaubert in his Herodias. This is another work, illustration, I should say, and on the right is perhaps his most famous image, the Peacock Skirt, inspired perhaps by Whistler's Peacock Room in Leyland's house. Remember, I mentioned that some time ago when he visited Leyland's house to see Whistler's Peacock Room. Now, at the beginning of 1893, he drew Salami for the studio. And Oscar Wilde was pleased when he first saw it. This was before he was commissioned. And in fact, at that stage, he sent an autographed copy of the play in French. It was still in French at that stage to Beardsley. I mention that to illustrate that Wilde was happy with the one illustration that he saw. However, when Beardsley was commissioned to illustrate the English translation, which incidentally was carried out by Lord Alfred Douglas, Wilde's enthusiasm seemed to diminish and their relationship went from bad to worse. Wilde said he thought Beardsley's drawings were too Japanese and he wanted Byzantine. And Wilde started to make fun of Beardsley. He described his drawings as like naughty scribbles a precocious boy makes on the margins of a copybook. And Beardsley was asked to change 4 of his drawings for the translated play. And Beardsley thought it was Wilde who had asked, but in fact it wasn't. We now know it was the publisher who was worried the drawings would offend the public with the nudity. But that again worsened their relationship. In fact, Wilde was concerned, but not by the nudity. His real concern was the drawings were so powerful, they would overshadow his play. So in retaliation for being asked to change his drawings, he added caricatures of Wilde, which we can see one on the top left drawing. What's called The Woman in the Moon is in fact a caricature of Wilde. And he went further. He produced this drawing, Oscar Wilde at Work. It's in response to Oscar Wilde's claim that he wrote Salami in French without needing to look anything up. And Beardsley shows him surrounded by reference works, the Bible, a French dictionary, a first course in French, French verbs at a glance. There's also, incidentally, Trois Contes, the Gustave Flaubert novel, which included the story of Salami, on which Wilde's play is based. Wilde was already annoyed that Beardsley had excluded him, remember, from the Yellow Book. And their relationship deteriorated even further with these insults. And in fact, Wilde went round London society telling everyone that he had invented Aubrey Beardsley. But in 1895, Beardsley and his sister Mabel did attend the opening of Oscar Wilde's The Importance of Being Earnest. That was in February, and that was the last time they met. It was at that opening that the Marquis of Queensberry, the father of Lord Alfred Douglas, the translator I mentioned, Wilde's devoted favourite, the Marquis of Queensberry was refused entry, and soon after Queensberry accused Wilde of being a sodomite, found witnesses to testify. Wilde was arrested. I'm cutting the story short a bit. Wilde was arrested, seen by the press carrying the Yellow Book, which I've already explained. All hell broke loose for Beardsley. Authors demanded and their publishers to remove all Beardsley's designs from the books. He was fired as art editor of the Yellow Book. The Yellow Books itself, people cancelled, and he and Mabel had to move to cheaper lodgings. So it all happened very quickly. Wilde, as we know, was found guilty of sodomy, sentenced to 2 years hard labour, was released in May 1897, travelled to Paris and then the south of France, never to return to Britain, and Beardsley also retired to the south of France to improve his health. And they were both actually in Morte on the Italian border for a year, but never met. This is an illustration from a book with a very long title, A Full and True Account of the Wonderful Mission of Earl Lavender, which lasted 1 night and 1 day, with a history of the pursuit of Earl Lavender and Lord Brum by Mrs. Scamler and Maud Emblem. I could explain the whole story, but the illustration shows a woman about to whip a man's back, and that in that form doesn't occur in the book, but there is in the book a scene of mass flagellation involving the 2 central characters, which seem to be, incidentally, they weren't earls and lords. These were just names that they gave themselves when they first met. One was running away from his bride and the other fled his wedding. They got drunk searching for the perfect woman, ended up in the cellar where they were flogged. They left in the morning, were reunited with their loved ones, and returned to the cellar where they were all flogged, and they went off to have a good meal. Flagellation was a common theme at this period. I don't know, maybe it was associated with the punishments meted out in upper caste men received at public school. I don't know. Right. So from this time on, Aubrey Beardsley, who was falsely associated with Oscar Wilde, because by then they'd already fallen out with each other. Notice the date. It's after the trial, which, as I said, had the result of him losing all of his publishers, but he did achieve 1 commission from a publisher called Leonard Smithers. Now, Leonard Smithers was a shady character who operated on the fringes of the book trade and issued small, shall we say, risque books. And he commissioned Beardsley to illustrate Aristophanes' bawdy satirical play Lysistrata, which you see here, Lysistrata on the right, haranguing the Athenian women. The central idea of the book, she's haranguing there was a war going on, and it's the play is a comic account of a woman's mission, Lysistrata's mission, to end the Peloponnesian War by denying all the men any sex. And Lysistrata persuaded the women to withhold sexual privileges from their husbands and lovers as a means of forcing the men to negotiate peace with Sparta. And the illustration shows the key moment in the play where she's exhorting the Athenian women to abstain from sexual congress until their husbands have declared peace. Don't ask me why they're naked. That's Beardsley. I can explain this, though. The monstrous erections, which today are seen as, I don't know, amusing rather than pornographic and reminiscent of graffiti on the walls of toilets. Then we know that in ancient Greek theatre, comedy actors did wear enormous stage prop phalluses made of leather, which you see here. He's also, Beardsley's having fun with the idea that the Spartans men were dressing their hair and wearing elegant footwear at a time of war without their virility being damaged. So he's showing that they can do both, wear elegant footwear, dress their hair, and still wage war. He became the most controversial and well-known artist of the period. He became renowned for his perverse images, his grotesque erotica, as it was called at the time. Yet, of course, he often addresses profound issues of life and death, sex and religion. Yet because he took the form of illustrations, many art critics regarded illustrations as a lower form of art. It was merely design in their view. And so he wasn't recognized really as a fine art artist. He was just a controversial illustrator. it wasn't until the 1960s, really. In 1966, there was an exhibition of his work, a large exhibition of his work at the V&A, when his work was reappraised, and it's now regarded as central to the development of modern art in the early 20th century. In fact, his images are still contentious today, which Beardsley, I think, would be delighted to discover that his work is still creating controversy 130 years later. As I said, Oscar Wilde called his drawings the naughty scribbles of a precocious boy, and many people found them shocking. Burne-Jones, and he'd fallen out with Burne-Jones by this stage, described them as detestable, more lustful than any I have seen. Not that I've seen many such. And in fact, Beardsley later had second thoughts. He converted to Catholicism in 1897, the following year, and the next year, 1898, the year he died, he wrote a letter, one of the last before he died, this letter to his publisher, Leonard Smithers, and a close friend, Herbert Pollitt, where he said, I implore you to destroy all copies of Lysistrata and bad drawings by all that is holy, all obscene drawings. Both men ignored Beardsley's wishes, and Smithers actually continued to sell reproductions as well as forgeries of Beardsley's work. Lots of people created forgeries of Beardsley's work because they were so outrageous, they became quite popular. Lots of people bought them. As I said earlier, the Beardsley wore clothes and had an identity that suggested he was gay, as we would call it now, that he was a homosexual. But as far as we know, he had no sexual relations with anyone. He did. A lot of his friends were friends of Oscar Wilde, were homosexuals, but he acquired new patrons like Leonard Smithers, who had a special interest in classical pornography, and there were topics of the period, and sexual orientation became one of the topics that was subject for academic study. And also there was a male taste for lewd and explicit stories from classical period and Arabic sources, as we've seen. And although these shocked the middle class bourgeois, they showed that the artist was free of prudish convention, and so that raised the artist's fame in many circles. Now, it was Smithers who offered to publish a successor to the Yellow Book called the Savoy, and this new magazine became popular amongst the middle classes, partly because it actually had quite high standards, and it was produced in a larger format, which enabled the illustrations to be seen more clearly. And this is one of the early illustrations by Beardsley from a work called Under the Hill, which was actually written by Beardsley. He was a writer later on, as well as illustrator. This is an erotic novel based on the story of Venus and Tannhauser, where Venus Beardsley replaces by Helen of Troy and publishes it as a novel in the Savoy called Under the Hill. And you'll notice that at this stage, he has developed a new overall pattern style with drawings crammed with detail. So this is like the third style he developed. These overall flat areas of plain white or black have given way to this crammed with detail, hatchings, prickings. Whistler was surprised and said, "Aubrey, I have made a very great mistake. You are a very great artist." So obviously this style appealed to Whistler. Another example, this is an illustration of a mock heroic poem by Alexander Pope called The Rape of the Lock. The story is based on a real incident which Pope makes fun of. It revolved around how Lord Peter stole a lock of hair from his beloved without her permission. And this step by step led to the breakdown of their relationship and the friendship between the two families. And Pope satirizes the incident, this tiny trivial incident, by comparing it with the superhuman world of the gods. Incidentally, the word rape in The Rape of the Lock is used in its earlier sense of to grab or snatch or carry off. He carried off a lock of her hair without permission. The poem with Beardsley's illustrations was published by Smithers in 1896. And here we see the moment when Belinda, the heroine whose hair is cut without her permission, is attacking the Baron opposite her with her fan when she discovers that he's stolen a lock of her hair during a game of cards she was playing. And the clothing portrays the clothes, the style in vogue in England in the 18th century. Now, we're now in 1896. This is near the time when Beardsley started to adopt Catholicism. We don't know whether this was because of his awareness of his mortality. In a way, I sort of doubt it, because he'd been aware of his mortality from the age of 7. Maybe a need for consolation. It could be that it chimed with the fashionable craze in the 1890s for mysticism and the occult. He made a number of drawings to illustrate the 6th satire of Juvenal. It's a misogynistic tale. Juvenal describes how the Empress Messalina is an exemplar of feminine lust and degeneracy. He describes in this satire, where he's making fun of all Roman women, he describes how she visits every night the brothels of ancient Rome, and where she poses as a prostitute to indulge her desires. And in this drawing by Beardsley, what he's showing here, in an earlier drawing, he'd shown her leaving the palace disguised. And in this drawing, he shows her coming back to the palace, coming back to the palace, dissatisfied, angry that her lusts remain unsatisfied, which is from the story, the 6th satire. The relevant line is, she closed her cell and still raging with unsatisfied desire, tired with the toil but yet unsated, she retired with sullied cheeks defiled and foul from the smoke of lamps, bore back the odor of the stews to the pillow of the emperor. In 1897, a month after he'd converted to Catholicism, he moved to the French Riviera, I think largely for his health. He drew the illustration on the right a few years previously, but I think it's a good illustration to show the effects of tuberculosis that he was suffering from more at this period in France. It reads, incidentally, by the twin gods, not all monsters are in Africa, referring to the monstrous disease he suffered from. And it shows a tiny person in the center of a large bed, diminishing him to an insignificant figure close to death. But of course, he wasn't insignificant in art. He laid the foundation of modern art of the 20th century. He wasn't afraid to be contentious, as we've seen, and even today his work is controversial. For example, although it was back in 1966, when the Victoria and Albert Museum publicly exhibited his work, there was a private gallery showing the same prints as were shown by the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was raided by the police, and the owner of the gallery was charged under the obscenity laws. That they didn't do the same with the Victoria and Albert Museum. I assume he got off. I don't know. Arthur Symonds, the Victorian art critic, described Beardsley as, he described him well, he could change his whole manner of working 5 or 6 times over the course of as many years, as we've seen. He seems to employ himself much of the time on trivial subjects, which I don't agree with, and yet retain almost unimpaired an originality which consisted in extreme beauty and the absolute certainty of design. So, but I think we've seen that even when representing ancient myths, Beardsley's drawings celebrated modern life, modern dress, modern costume, and the large areas of black, which we often see in his work, I think suggest, and I take a line here from one of his biographies, half hidden but always present urban depravity. By the end of his life, he had completely rejected Burne-Jones, by the way, and William Morris, and in fact was proposing a new magazine be published to, in his words, attack untiringly and unflinchingly the Burne-Jones and Morrisian medieval business. Beardsley changed the view of what was acceptable in late Victorian society. He was known as the imp of the perverse, which was a metaphor that was used at the time to describe, maybe it applies even today, to describe the urge we all sometimes feel to do the wrong thing solely because we can do it, but we know it's the wrong thing. This imp, the impulse that leads to an otherwise decent person into mischief or worse, we have seen Beardsley took the imp of the perverse, ran with it to extremes, but I think in doing so, he changed the way, or started to change the way we think about gender and sexuality today. And he died, and this is his gravestone overlooking the town of Monon. He died of tuberculosis in the Cosmopolitan Hotel in Menton in the south of France. He was just 25 years old.